For our sermon this morning, we are looking at a sermon called Story Part 5, A New Model. And you may remember quite a while ago now, back in the beginning of March, even back further into February, we had begun this sermon series where we started looking at big pieces or chunks of the biblical story and how they fit together. And the way we described it was like a puzzle, and you take one piece and you look at it and you put it down, and then a couple weeks later you take another piece and talk about it and put it aside, and eventually you start to see a picture kind of form and in an idea sort of form throughout that. So we've been looking at these big pieces, big chunks of the biblical story. We've talked about Abraham, we've talked about the temple, we've talked about sin, and animal sacrifice even, and why Israel did that and what that meant in relation to their sin. The last sermon we looked at in this series, number 4, we began to talk about the future Messiah and in how the prophets of the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, I mean, we could just go through a whole list of them, pointed the way of hope, pointed the way of the future for the people of Israel. And one of the things that we picked up on in the second or third sermon in this series was the fact that God gave the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, a bunch of commandments. And out of a bunch of those commandments, that we know the 10 commandments the best. I mean, we know those. We might be able to say at least a few of them off the top of our head. And one of the things I said, and it was a kind of a shocking thing to hear several weeks ago now, is that we don't have to follow the 10 commandments as New Testament Christians, as believers today. The 10 commandments were given to the nation of Israel. And that's surprising to hear a pastor maybe say, you're not expected to follow the 10 commandments, but it was given specifically to a people group, the nation of Israel. Just like the promise to Abraham about how his descendants would grow into a great nation, just how that was a promise to Abraham. The 10 commandments were a series of commands given specifically to Israel. And what I want to do this morning is pick up a little bit on that idea. As I said, we don't have to follow the 10 commandments, but are there commandments that we as believers today have to follow, and how do those fit into the Old Testament commandments that Jesus gave or that God gave to the nation of Israel? And so I want to spend some time talking about that tomorrow. So the prophets are pointing the way to a future Messiah, pointing the way of hope for the people of Israel who are in desperate times. Their walls have crumbled, they're in exile, all these bad things are happening because of their disobedience in the Old Testament. Now, at the end of the Old Testament, we have a book called the Book of Malachi. And between the Book of Malachi and the first book in the New Testament, which in the order we have it is the Book of Matthew, we have what are sometimes referred to as the 400 silent years. What we mean when we say that, the 400 silent years, is that in that period of time, there's no inspired writing, no biblical writing that we have as part of our scripture. And so it's not like we're not saying God's not doing anything. We're not saying God's disappeared. We're not saying that nothing's being written or that nothing important is happening. All we're saying is that there's no record, no writings that we have in that time period that are considered to be the words of God, biblical writing, words of truth to us, is part of Scripture. And so sometimes those are called 400 silent years. Now, as the Jewish people are waiting for the Messiah, there's some candidates that have come and gone in that 400-year period. Judas of Maccabees was one. He was a great military leader They thought he was the Messiah. They thought he was going to be the one that would lead them back to greatness. But ultimately, Judas of Maccabees died in a war. Ultimately, he didn't fulfill the requirements of the Messiah. If you've ever been to a church service near Christmas, you probably have a good idea about what the Jewish people thought they would be receiving when we talk about the Messiah. They thought they would be getting a military leader, a conqueror, somebody that would bring their nation back to a time of prosperity, somebody that would free them from the Roman oppression, somebody that would lead them into a time where their crops would grow and everybody would be prosperous and all these things. And so that's what they were expecting. And so they looked at Judas of Maccabees. They thought he was the one. He showed some potential, but that didn't happen. When we get to the New Testament, there's this really explosion of literature, explosion of writing we have in our New Testament, and all of it is centered around this man named Jesus. And we see as soon as Jesus arrives on the scene, we see these books start to pop up. Everybody seems to be talking about him. Everybody seems to be writing about Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and other even books outside of the Bible talk about and speak about this man named Jesus Christ. And some are claiming he's the Messiah, and others aren't believing that he is the Messiah. Some are claiming that he is the one that has been sent to bring Israel back. Others are saying, no, that's not possible. And so if you are a first century Jew, there's some things about Jesus that are really intriguing, and a few things that are really infuriating about him. The intriguing part is that people are saying he's the Messiah, that he claims to be the Messiah even. And he's doing miracles and all sorts of miraculous kinds of works and helping all sorts of people. And so there's a part about him that's very intriguing. You want to know more. You want to pay attention. You want to get to find out a little bit more about this man that claims to be sent from God, that claims to be the Messiah. But there's also some parts about Jesus that are very infuriating if you are a religious Jew. For religious Jews, some things that were very, very important to them was the keeping of the law. That is the law of Moses. That is the Old Testament laws, the Ten Commandments, and all the other laws. At this point, there's over 600 of them. So the keeping of the law and the temple rituals, which included going to the temple for worship and keeping Sabbath and in all these kinds of things. And the infuriating part about Jesus is that Jesus at times seemed to play fast and loose with what we would call the Jewish law. And if you're a Jew, this is one of the most important things about your faith. This is one of the things that you have taken seriously for much of your life. Your great-grandparents did all these things. Your grandparents, your parents. This is part of your heritage. This is part of who you are. Your whole life is built around, wrapped up in the temple and the law of Moses and keeping the law of Moses. So now you have a guy named Jesus who claims to be the Messiah, but if we're honest, at times seems to play awful loose with this law that you've been taught is so important to keep to the nth degree. And so Jesus followed the Sabbath, but Jesus didn't follow the Sabbath as strictly as most Jews would have liked, as most Jews would have wanted. And what I want to do is show you this passage. It's an important passage. It's in the book of Matthew, and it's in Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 19. And I want to sort of set up our sermon today with this passage. This is what it says. Jesus is speaking. He says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus comes, and there's concerns about how loosely Jesus seemed to keep the law. And I use seem because that was just people's impression. And Jesus says something very, very important about the law here. He says, first, that he didn't come to destroy it. That's pretty clear. He didn't come to abolish it, didn't come to tear it down. But he did say that he is the natural conclusion of the law. In fact, he says it, and I highlighted it there in yellow. He says, I have come to fulfill the law. Jesus is the final piece. Jesus is like the last chapter in a book. He says that the law will not pass away until all is accomplished. And even by saying that, Jesus is implying that one day it would pass away, that one day the law would come, the law of Moses, the Old Testament law would come to its natural conclusion. And Jesus, at other points, in other places, claims to be the perfect sacrifice that would bring to completion the Old Testament law and actually complete things that the law never could, accomplish things that the law never could. Jesus would be that once and for all payment for sin. Jesus realizes that in his lifetime, because of him, because of what he would do, the law of Moses would reach its natural end. It's kind of like a new car. Think about the Old Testament or the Old Testament law in the context of a new vehicle. When you buy a new vehicle, it's great, it's flashy, everything works well, but you know from the moment that you buy it that that clock starts ticking down. You know it won't last forever. You know things are going to need repair. You know that one day that new car at the moment is going to be an old car, and in that one day it will be replaced. And that's how Jesus viewed the Old Testament law. It had its place, it had its importance, it helped Israel. But from the moment that he gave that law, the clock was ticking on it. In other words, he knew that someday he would come along and he would fulfill it, he would replace it, that it would reach its end, that it would reach its natural conclusion. And Jesus, when it would reach its natural conclusion, Jesus would usher in a new covenant for the people. In fact, this language is all across the New Testament. We think about it every time we have communion. Jesus talks about with his disciples the new covenant, which is brought about or brought in with his blood. And so Jesus is not to abolish the law. He's coming to bring it to its conclusion. And a couple other things that we might point out about the law here is that Jesus would usher in the new covenant, and the new covenant comes with a new law. So this isn't, the new covenant is not beside the old covenant. They're not together. This isn't like an updated version of the old covenant, like Windows 7 is updated to Windows 10. Jesus is bringing about something completely different. Jesus is beginning something completely new. Jesus announced in the New Testament that he was the Messiah, and he announced to people that he was ushering in a new covenant. Now, here is a huge thought, and in fact, it's so huge that you may want to just sort of sit and think about this and kind of sift through this for a couple moments. When Jesus came, and when Jesus ushered in the new covenant, this religion, which is called Judaism, which revolved around the temple and the Old Covenant, the Old Testament law, at that moment should have completely shut down. In fact, everybody that was a follower of Judaism, the Jewish religion, everybody that was a follower of Judaism should have instantly become a follower of Jesus. Because Jesus is replacing something. Jesus is coming along and replacing the old covenant with the new covenant. Now, of course, we know that doesn't happen because in so many ways in life it doesn't happen. We get used to things. We get set in patterns. We get stuck in our old ways. We have a hard time letting go of the old and grabbing hold of the new. But that's what should have happened. They should have grabbed a hold of the new, which is Jesus, which is the new covenant that Jesus brought with him. In fact, the moment that Jesus came, they should have, and brought this new covenant, they should have shut the temple doors and said, everybody that followed Judaism is now a follower of the Messiah, because the Messiah brings us something, a new covenant with him that is superior than the old one. Now, that's a lot to take in, a lot of information. It's important to remember that the new covenant comes with a new ethic, a new teaching. We might say a new law. And this is where kind of the meat of our message, the meat of our thinking here is, what did this new law look like? What are the important elements of this new law? In fact, Jesus sums up this new ethic, this new teaching, in a couple different passages. The first one is in Matthew chapter 22 and verses 36 to 40. And I'm just going to read those. This is what Jesus said. This is part of his new covenant. He says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" So a lawyer is asking this of Jesus. He says, and he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and the fourth most commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." And so Jesus, and this is what's so brilliant about what Jesus is saying, under this new covenant, Jesus is taking 613, to be exact, laws and commandments that the people of Israel had, and he actually sums them up in just two commandments. He actually makes it easier to remember, easier to follow by summing them up with just two commandments that people have to follow. So if you're a believer like I am, if you're a Christian today like I am, these are the two commandments that you have to follow. These are the things upon which you build your entire life. Jesus says the two most important things are love God, and love each other. In fact, he states it another way in John, and we're going to look at that. John says, "A new commandment I give to you." So Jesus is giving a new commandment, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now think about that for a moment. Jesus is saying that the quickest way to understand, the quickest way to determine, to figure out, to cut through all the fluff, we might say, of whether someone is truly a believer, as to whether somebody is truly a disciple, a follower of Jesus, is whether they love one another. Think about that for just a minute. It's not how much money they give to a church. It's not how often they attend a church. It's not even how much they know about the Bible. The quickest, most effective way to tell whether somebody is truly a disciple of Jesus is if they love one another, if they love each other. And that is maybe your people in your church, your other people in your Christian community, but that's also your neighbor. That's the people you work with. That's the people down the street. That's the people in your community that you have a hard time getting along with, that are difficult. The quickest way to tell whether somebody is a believer is to look at their life and to determine whether they truly love others. Now that is absolutely remarkable when you think about it. I mean, that's an amazing thing for Jesus to say. And what I want to do is tell you why this new ethic, this new commandment that Jesus gives to us as believers today, the one that replaces all those laws of Moses from the Old Testament, I want to tell you why it is both brilliant and both extremely challenging. And here's the reason why. The sheer amount of laws that the people had to follow, again, over 600, was suffocating. Jesus called it, at other points in the New Testament, he called it a burden for the people. I mean, you imagine trying to think through, especially the laws on the Sabbath became quite complicated. Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do this? Have I walked too far? Have I done this right? And so the whole process of trying to keep those laws, and remembering them and memorizing them, and then following them was a burden, to the people. It was suffocating, to the people. And what Jesus did, this is so important, is Jesus replaced those 600 laws with 2 laws. Jesus once again made religion a matter of the heart. Jesus made religion again a matter of the heart, rather than just a matter of duty. I'm going to try to illustrate this, and I hope this makes sense as you're trying to think through this. My daughter Lydia, she doesn't love to clean her room, but just imagine that I said to her, Lydia, go clean your room, and I'm going to tell you what is acceptable before your room is clean. And so I might give her a list, and I could say, here's your bedspread, and your bedspread is allowed no more than 4 wrinkles in it. And it has to be, this is allowed, this is your measuring stick, this is your measuring rod. I could go through and say, the floor is allowed 3 items on it. In other words, I could go down through a whole list of things. I could come up, I suppose, with hundreds and hundreds, a list of hundreds of things of clean your room, and this is the guidelines to follow. Now you can imagine that just the sheer amount of rules that I could list for Lydia, to make sure that room was clean would be a burden. She would be going through and thumbing through and saying, oh man, I forgot about this one, I forgot about this one. And so the sheer number would be a burden. Not only that, but knowing children the way they do, she would start looking at all the sheets of paper I'd given to her, and she would start looking for loopholes. She would say, okay, we didn't specify exactly how this had to be done, and so I'm going to do it this way. And so there's a sense where, at least in some occasions, one might be tempted to do a job that is passable. It meets the standard, meets the bar, meets the requirements, but it's the worst job that one could possibly do while still getting a pass. And it's kind of like the bare minimum. It's kind of like the lowest possible standard by not getting in trouble. That's what happens when you start looking for a bunch of loopholes. How can I get out of this? How can I do this and still get by, but not do the best job? So that's one illustration. That's one way that you could look at it. Although I have other options that I could explore. I have other options that I could use to try to get Lydia's room clean. And I could say to Lydia, Lydia, I'm your dad. I love you, and I know that you love me. And she might say, you know what? Because I love Dad, I'm going to clean my room. And since I love Dad, I want to make him happy. And I know one of the things that makes him happy is having a clean room. But what's interesting about that, and that second example is more like the new covenant. The first example, highlights or leverages my authority as a parent. My authority that says you have to do this, and because I'm the parent and tell you to do it, this is what you have to do. So it leverages my authority as a parent. But what's interesting is the second example leverages the relationship that Lydia and I have as father and as daughter. It leveraged the relationship instead of authority. And so in the second example, Lydia is at least more likely going to say, you know what, I'm inspired to do the best job possible. I'm inspired to do the best that I can do, because my dad and I have this relationship, and because I want to make him happy. So in the second example, she moves and acts out of love rather than out of fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of not meeting the standard that was set. In fact, she might even clean her room without being asked, because she's not obligated to do it, but because of a love that she has. And so this is what's brilliant about Jesus' two commandments that he gives to Christians. Jesus' two commandments, in one sense, frees us from all sorts of necessary ritual and all sorts of necessary things that could potentially be a burden on us, exhausting, just to try to learn them all and go through them all. But in a challenging way, that these two commandments actually ask for more of us, because they require us to engage our hearts, not just our hands. They require us to do things out of a love, out of a relationship with Jesus Christ, not just because the law says that we have to do them. And so in Jesus' new ethic, new commandment, these new laws, these new teachings that Jesus gives to us, it actually requires more of us. Not just our emotions, our actions are engaged, but our hearts are engaged as well. So you have two laws today as believers, two laws that ought to dictate every action, every word, everything we do. And here's the other thing that is interesting, and this is in relation to the law of Moses. This is in relation to the Ten Commandments that Jesus gave to a specific nation, the nation of Israel, is that when you really start to narrow down what Jesus said, when you really start to think through what Jesus says, you'll find that there's a lot of things, a lot of elements of the law of Moses that are also connected to the two commandments that Jesus gives us in the New Testament today. And so let's just think through this. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So that was back in the Matthew passage. So if we start to go through the Ten Commandments, and Jesus tells us in the New Testament that we ought to love our neighbor as ourselves. So you think of the Ten Commandments. What are a few of those commandments? Jesus or the text in the Old Testament says, "Do not steal." So, well, wait a minute. If I love my neighbor, as Jesus tells me to love my neighbor, am I going to take things that belong to my neighbor? Well, of course, I'm not going to. Another one of those laws, Old Testament Ten Commandment laws, is do not lie or do not bear false witness against your neighbor. And Jesus says, again, love your neighbor. So if I love my neighbor as Jesus tells me to love my neighbor, then I'm not going to bear false witness against my neighbor. In fact, I'm going to do everything I can to help them. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to speak truth. And so when you really start to sort of sort through and sift through what Jesus is saying, we see that there's actually a lot of elements of what is spoken to the nation of Israel that are imported into what Jesus is saying to us as Christians today. Love your God and love your neighbor includes a lot of things. Love your neighbor means that you're going to act, or just loving your God or loving your neighbor means that you're going to act generously and gently. Loving your neighbor and loving your God means that you're going to act with self-restraint rather than self-indulgence and selfishness. Loving your God requires that you put God above anything else in your life. And so what we're seeing is Jesus gives us two commandments, and these are the two commandments that we have to live our lives by. To replace the law of Moses, to replace the law that was given to the nation of Israel. But even within these two commandments, there's a lot expected of us as believers. In fact, in many ways, they're more difficult because now we have to gauge our intentions, our hearts, our attitudes. It's not just about what we do or what we don't do, but it's also about why we do it and the motivation behind why we do it. So it's funny, even though we only have two, the New Testament commandments that Jesus gives are actually more restrictive than the Old Testament commandments that they replace. This is a fulfillment of Jeremiah, and I'm going to bring up that verse so that we look at this. This is Jeremiah 31, verse 33. Jesus or Jeremiah says this, God speaking through Jeremiah. He says, "But this is the covenant which I shall make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." What is happening here in this passage, it's become very clear that the Jews were not very good at keeping the Old Testament laws. The Jews were not very good at following everything that God had told them they needed to follow. And Jesus is sort of giving us a little picture into the future. He's telling us that there will come a day where the law will be different. Instead of 10 commandments on stone tablets, it's a law that's going to be stamped upon their hearts. What that is referring to is just the transformation that Jesus makes in our hearts as we come to know him as Lord and Savior. And so what Jesus is saying is like the law of the 10 commandments, the stone tablets, which are visible, which are written down, that people could see, it's actually going to be replaced by something else, by something that's more personal, by something that engages more of us in our hearts as well. So here's kind of our final thoughts for tonight. As we think about these two new commandments, as we think about the commandments that guide and dictate and determine how we act today as believers. And the reason that this is such a big part of the puzzle is because Jesus is giving us something completely new that is the foundation for how we act as Christians. As we think about that tonight, one of the ways a pretty well-known preacher has described this before is just to think about this way. How does love require me to act? And so I just want to challenge you with that this morning. How does love require me to act in any given situation? And the truth is, often love requires us to act in ways that we don't want to act. What does it mean to truly love my neighbor? If that's the commandment upon which my life revolves around, what does it mean for me to love my neighbor? What does that mean about how I'm treating my neighbor? And what are some ways that God is challenging me right now to be kinder to my neighbor, to love my neighbor more, to help them more, to be a better witness to them? The other element of that, and again, these aren't really two separate commandments because they're so they're disconnected so closely. But what does it mean for me to love my God? If that is the priority of my life, what does it mean for me to love my God? What are some ways that love what are some things I guess that love is requiring of me to do that would demonstrate more that I love my God? And so maybe the struggle for you is prayer time, or just taking quiet moments to reflect and talk to and listen to the voice of God. Maybe that's a struggle for you. Maybe it's the understanding or the study or the digging into the Word of God that's been a struggle for you. But it's interesting that under those commandments, a love for God requires us to know God, requires us to study, requires us to engage both our minds and our actions, but also our hearts in pursuing Him, getting to know Him better. So what is it that love requires of us? And love is the thing that really is the cornerstone of this new model that Jesus brings to us in the New Testament, which is love each other and love your God. And I hope that today that just kind of helps you fill in how we today as Christians are called to live differently than the nation of Israel was. Why there's a lot of things in the Old Testament that they did and they were supposed to do and they were called to do, but that we are no longer called to do. Why we follow 2 commandments rather than 600 commandments, because Jesus brought with him this new model, which is love your God and love each other. I hope this was just an encouragement to you today, and may God bless you.